Industrial Revolution. Today we're going to be talking about the earliest history of electronic music, and which really consists of a sort of disparate collection of inventors who experimented with creating sound using electricity. The context of these inventions is the Industrial Revolution, which took place roughly in the 1800s and was really centered around the 1850s. So the Industrial Revolution was really characterized by the rapid development of new technology, and it also ushered in a new era of society and a new understanding of what modern life was. And now with the Industrial Revolution, modern life was really characterized by electricity, machinery, and all of these new technologies. So some of the inventions that happened in the Industrial Revolution include the steam engine, factory production machinery, electric light, the telephone, and the telegraph. And all of these inventions really radically altered people's perceptions of space and time. If you think about it this way, if you wanted to get from point A to point B, say maybe from one state to another, before the invention of the steam engine, that would maybe take several weeks using a horse and a carriage. But with the steam engine, it then only took a matter of hours and maybe a day. Same with the telephone and the telegraph. Prior to those inventions, if you wanted to say, talk to your mother in a state away, you would have to write a letter and it would take several days to get to her. Whereas with the telephone or the telegraph, you could communicate with someone virtually instantaneously. And so this really shifted how people thought about space and how people thought about time, and also really how people connected with each other. And all of these new changes in perception are really the backdrop of how people started to think about music and art at this time, which we'll talk about in Lecture 3. And something to note is that experiments with the electronic generation of sound, or generating sound using electricity, actually predate the invention of the light bulb. So inventors and experimenters were really interested in all the possibilities of what this new discovery of electricity could really do beyond just the invention of the light bulb, which is probably what we're most familiar with. So one of the earliest experiments with the electronic generation of sound is something called the musical telegraph, and it was invented by a man named Elisha Gray, who was a telegraph engineer and inventor, and he was really sort of an amateur tinkerer. He worked as a telegraph engineer, but in his spare time, he would create new telegraph inventions. And the musical telegraph is really no different. And what he did was he used basically telegraph technology in order to transmit different tones across a telegraph wire. So the way that he did this, he created a 1-octave keyboard, and you can actually see it here on the slide. That just means that there's 8 keys. And each key produced a different frequency or a different tone, so it sounded a different musical note. And the way that he did this was using a very simple circuit with a very simple battery, metal strips, which produced a vibratory current. So that vibratory current is how he changed the frequency of the tone. And as we talked back to in Lecture 1, that frequency of how fast something is vibrating translates to the pitch that we hear, whether we hear something that's high or whether we hear something that is low. And what's interesting about this is 2 things. One is that it was monophonic, which means that you could only transmit one note at one time. So you could play a simple melody, but you couldn't play chords. You couldn't play more than one note at a time. And the other thing that he actually ripped this idea off from his nephew, who was exploring with metal strips and electric current in a bathtub in their home. And he noticed that if he changed the vibratory current, he could actually change the frequency and create little melodies. So then Elijah Gray kind of adapted this using his telegraph technology into the musical telegraph. And another thing to note is that he did later create a polyphonic version so that he could play more than one note at a time. And the other thing to note is that this was just an amateur project. These were one-offs. They were never sold commercially. It wasn't something that was widely available. This was just one thing that Elijah Gray created and experimented with. Now, this is really different than the honorable mention of Thomas Edison and Thomas Edison's phonograph. So the phonograph was actually mechanical, meaning it required zero electricity. And you can see here in this picture on the bottom right that there's a crank, and so one would actually have to crank this physically in order to hear the sound back of the recording. So the important thing about the phonograph is that it was the first device that could both record and play back sound. And as you might imagine, even though we now think of recording technology as really intricately connected to listening to music, this was actually originally thought of as more of an office device, something that you could record speech, you could record memos to yourself. So it was really important that someone could both record and play back the sound really easily and really quickly. And the way that this works is that there's a needle that etches the sound pattern into a wax cylinder, and then that same needle, when it's spun very quickly, both picks up and amplifies that sound to play it back. And you can see here there's a cone which also further amplifies the sound. So this the phonograph and the gramophone and other recording technology ended up being hugely influential and played a big role in electronic music later. And these were mass produced, so this was the first way in which people tended to kind of interact with technologies in order to hear music. So again, this really shaped how people would interact with electronic music later. So that's the end of part 1 of lecture 2, and in the next section we will talk about the development of the first large-scale electronic music instrument, sort of an early precursor to the synthesizer. So we just talked about Elijah Gray and Thomas Edison and the phonograph and the musical telegraph, and now we're going to talk about the telharmonium, which was one of the first really substantial electronic music instruments. So the telharmonium was created in the early 1900s by a man named Thaddeus Cahill, who was a pretty eccentric entrepreneur and inventor. The telharmonium was a massive organ-like instrument, and you can see it here on the bottom right. It looks kind of like an organ. And that's really sort of, I think, was his inspiration for the telharmonium. And what's interesting about the telharmonium is that it was really a complete system. So you have tone generators that both make new tones and you can shape them into different kinds of sounds. It also had a keyboard interface, which you can see here, in which someone played it, and a speaker system. And this, again, in a lot of ways, really prefigured sort of the contemporary synthesizer that was created in the 60s and 70s, something that you all might be a little bit more familiar with. So let's break down all the different parts here. So the way in which the sound was created was through 150 massive rotating pitch shafts. And what that looks like is just these massive metal shafts that spun really, really quickly. And then they had at the very tip a metal brush and a small circuit that would translate that rotation into electricity. And then that was connected to this keyboard, and depending on which key was pressed, a different pitch shaft would be activated at a different frequency, and what would happen is, to create, say, the sound of a trumpet or the sound of a keyboard, different of these pitch shafts would be combined to create new tones. And this is something called additive synthesis. So each of these, each individual pitch shaft created basically something very close to a sine tone or a single frequency. And then by adding multiple frequencies together, one could create unique tones or unique timbres with the telharmonium. So again, this is something called additive synthesis, or building up unique tones by layering sine tones or single frequencies. And the way that it worked with the telharmonium is that you could have 7 possible combinations at one time. And so going back to lecture 1, when we learned about overtones, there would typically be 1 fundamental and then 6 partials. So with that combination, he could create pretty much imitate most orchestral instruments and also create some new kinds of sounds. So then once when someone pressed down a note or a chord, all of those rotating pitch shafts would be rotating at different frequencies. They would be sent to a mixer where the additive synthesis would happen, and then it would go out to a speaker system. And there were multiple ways in which the speaker system was activated, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what you can see here in the picture on the bottom right is that it was actually, in one instance, a ballroom in downtown Manhattan where people could go and listen to this electronically generated sound. Another thing to note is, a few more things to note are about the keyboard. So it had a couple of pretty unique features, and one was that it was pressure sensitive, meaning that if you press down harder, it would sound louder, and if you press down a little softer or lighter, it would be quieter. So you could control the volume based on how hard you press down on a key, just like with a normal piano. Another thing is that it had stops and settings just like an organ. So you could just press a button or pull out a stop instead of to create basically different kinds of sounds rather than having to press a lot of buttons and control a lot of things. So there were sort of like, there were settings basically that you could tap into. And again, this was really designed to imitate orchestral instruments, sort of like an old-fashioned organ. Another thing to note that's important about Thaddeus Cahill and sort of to contemporary electronic music is that he actually invented or coined the term synthesize to refer to this shaping of sound using electricity or using this additive synthesis technique that he developed. Another thing that's pretty fascinating about the telharmonium is that it was actually huge. It weighed over 200 tons. So when they wanted to move the telharmonium from Mount Holyoke, where it was invented, to downtown Manhattan, where it would be housed, it actually took 30 railway cars to get it there. And then once it was in Manhattan, just all of the different parts of it took up an entire city block in a basement of a Manhattan building. So Thaddeus Cahill was more than just an inventor. He was also an entrepreneur, and he actually had a really interesting commercial idea for the telharmonium. So beyond just transmitting the music in a ballroom in downtown Manhattan, he had the idea that this electronically generated music would be transmitted over telephone lines to businesses throughout not only New York City, but potentially throughout the entire country. So we can really see this as sort of a precursor to what we now think of as muzak or elevator music, just that kind of piped in music to a grocery store or an elevator, an office building, etc. And here's a quote in which he talks about it. He said he wanted to generate music electronically with tones of good quality and great power, and with perfect musical expression, and to distribute music electrically generated by what we may term original electrical generation from a central station to a translating instrument located at different points. So that's really a complicated way of saying he wanted to transmit it over the telephone. And you can see here in these pictures both the sort of keyboard interface, as I call it, where someone would actually play the telharmonium in this ballroom in downtown Manhattan, and the basement where all these rotating pitch shafts were housed. And you can see in this picture there's a man for scale. So each of these were huge. They were probably 10 feet long, 2 feet wide, 6 feet tall. They were huge. And so it was really an undertaking to house this instrument. And as you can imagine, because of that, it actually wasn't a success. And there were several reasons. One, it was super expensive. It would break down and they had to upkeep it. It was also really impractical. It caused power outages throughout Manhattan. There was also a lot of crosstalk when it was transmitted over the telephone line. So for instance, if someone was listening to their classical music station, all of a sudden the neighbor's mom would come in and they'd hear them complaining about their neighbor next door. So it was pretty impractical. And that's it for the telharmonium. Next up, we'll talk about the radio and the invention of the theremin and the Ons Martineau. So we just learned about the telharmonium, and now we're going to talk about the radio, the theremin, and the Ons Martineau. So radio technology, some experiments with transmitting electromagnetic waves to carry information and electricity date back really to the 1800s. Some of the experiments that were necessary for radio to exist happened in the early 1800s, but it's really in the 1880s with someone named Hertz who really developed a lot of the technology that made radio happen. And we're not going to get too deep into radio technology, but the important thing to know is that basically early radio technology was really influential to early electronic music technology. And so just a couple things to share is that in the early 1900s, radio transmission was sophisticated enough that it was starting to be used, especially for more military operations and business. For instance, with ships out at sea, they could connect to people on land wirelessly, which was really important because if you think about the telegraph before, that really needed wires to transmit the information. So with radio, people out at sea could connect to people on land without any wires or cables. And it started to be sort of available by the early 19 teens commercially, and that's really where we see broadcasting start to develop. And it's not really until after World War I that radio technology becomes really widely available, and that's where we start to see radio become really a mainstay of just kind of the average American household. Pretty much every household had a radio. It was the primary vehicle by which they got news and entertainment. It was also a way that people could communicate with each other. But something that's kind of important and indicative of radio, which I'll talk about more throughout the quarter, is the ways in which electronic music technology is really pretty deeply connected to the development of technology during war. And what we see is that during war, there's just advancements in leaps and bounds of this radio technology that made it much more sophisticated and available and useful in people's homes. So we'll talk about that more later. And the reason why I mention radio is that the next two instruments that we're going to be talking about, both the theremin and the Arns Martineau, were developed and created by radio engineers using radio technology. So the theremin is probably the early electronic instrument that most of you are going to be familiar with. You've maybe heard it before or seen it in emulation or someone perform one on TV or on YouTube. And it has a really interesting history. So it was created by a man named Leon Theremin in the 1920s, and Theremin was a Russian inventor and radio engineer who, during World War I, created something called the radio watchman. And the radio watchman was sort of an early form of radar in which he used radio waves to detect an intruder by detecting a body's capacitance. So we know that the body contains a certain amount of electricity. And but Theremin was really interested in music, and so he used this radio watchman technology to develop an instrument which he called the etherophone, and which we now know as the theremin. And you can see Leon Theremin here on the right playing his theremin instrument. And the way that it worked is that it's a cabinet, and it has these two and it has these two antennas. The vertical antenna controlled pitch and the horizontal antenna controlled volume, and one would play the theremin by waving their hands. So it was really cool. It looked like you're just playing music by just moving your hands in thin air. And the earliest versions also had a grounded plate, and so that completed the circuit. And it works by a principle called heterodyning that was really important to radio and developed during World War I, especially. And heterodyning, basically what it is, it's when you have two frequencies that are inaudible to humans, so really, really high frequencies typically, and you don't hear either of these two frequencies, but they're really close together, so you actually hear the difference between the two. And the way that works here is the theremin has two oscillators, one which is fixed and one which is variable, and when you move your hand to control the frequency or the pitch, you're changing that variable frequency, but instead of hearing both of those oscillators, we're actually hearing the difference between the two. So again, the principle of heterodyning is instead of hearing two frequencies, you're hearing the sum or the difference between two of them. And again, the vertical antenna controls the pitch and the horizontal antenna controls volume. So you have to use both hands to play the theremin, and the people that play this develop some really sophisticated techniques to be able to play this well and play classical music, basically. And here's a quote by Theremin. He said, "I conceived of an instrument that would create sound without using any mechanical energy, like the conductor of an orchestra." So the conductor was really his inspiration. And a couple of notes to make is that it basically the sound is continuous. So once your hand is in the field, it's really you can't stop the flow of sound, and so it creates these sweeping glissandos. And a glissando is just a continuous slide or sweep through several pitches. And so in order to be able to create the sound of discrete pitches, one has to really carefully control the volume, which we'll see in a minute. And another thing to note is that the theremin is also monophonic, so it can only make one note at a time. You can't create chords. It's really a melodic instrument, more like a violin, something like that. So here is a video of Theremin playing his own instrument.
Электромузыкальный инструмент терминвокс – это первый инструмент такого типа. Это песенно-голосовой инструмент. В нем управление мелодией достигается посредством влияния на электромагнитное поле около инструмента.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, but you can see that by using really fine finger patterns with his right hand and then carefully moving his left hand, he creates the impression of discrete pitches, but then he also uses kind of the sliding glissando for impact when you're going between certain pitches, and also that volume to create something kind of like a swelling feeling that really works pretty well for more sentimental classical music. And you can also see that he's shaking his right hand, creating what we call a vibrato effect, which is where you kind of carefully go between minute frequencies, and it creates, again, kind of it's like the evocation of feeling. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Ons Martenot as well. So just to talk a little bit about Theremin's bio, as I mentioned before, he worked for the Russian government during World War I and created the radio Watchman and other radar-like technology for the Russian government. But then in 1927, he moved to the United States, and we think now that he was likely a spy for the Russian government. But like a lot of spies, maybe you've seen the TV show The Americans, he really loved being in the United States, and he actually invented the theremin in the United States. And he lived in the US for about 10 years, and then in 1938, he was actually forcibly removed by the Russian government. So it's a bit of a scandalous story. And the story sort of comes full circle. You know, people wouldn't hear from him for a really long time. I think there were maybe 2 decades or so where after he was forcibly removed from the US, no one heard from him. And then throughout the end of his later life, he really wanted to make it back to the United States, and he finally did in the 1990s. And we actually have video of him giving a lecture and playing the theremin at Stanford, which you can find on YouTube. And then he died shortly after. And now we're going to go back a little bit in time and talk about Clara Rockmore, who is really the most famous theremin virtuoso, and her name and theremin are kind of intertwined inextricably. It's hard to talk about one without talking about the other. And Clara Rockmore was actually an immigrant to the US from Russia, so I think she and theremin sort of shared that bond, and they knew each other personally. And when she met theremin, she was a young violin virtuoso who had a really bad injury on her hand, so she could no longer play the violin. However, her skill with the violin, and especially the finger patterns that she used to play the violin, she then adapted to play the theremin. And so that's really what I want you to pay attention to when you watch this video, is the really intricate finger patterns that she uses to create the melody, and then also control the volume and control the melody through the volume with her left hand. And so here we go, the Swan by Camille Saint-Saëns, performed by Clara Rockmore. And I'm just going to play you a clip of this now. If you go to the required listening tab, you'll be able to watch the whole video. Okay, I'm going to stop it there, but you can listen to the rest on your own. And you can see here that she just has such fine control. She has really exquisite musicianship, and it's really no wonder how she sort of was able to make the theremin so famous. And something that I'll put in your extras at the end of the lecture is there was a Google Doodle of Clara Rockmore playing the theremin, and it actually, you can sort of play the first few notes of this very song. So it's a fun thing to check out. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about the Ons Martineau. The Ons Martineau was created also at a similar time in 1928 by a Parisian radio engineer and inventor named Maurice Martineau. And Ons means waves in French, so the Ons Martineau roughly translates to Martineau's waves. And the Ons Martineau uses the exact same heterodyning technique that theremin used in the theremin. So again, what he did was he had two oscillators playing inaudible frequencies that were then sort of combined, and what we hear is the difference between the two. And there are several versions of the Ons Martineau, and the first, which I actually don't have a picture of, was just a very simple box with a metal ribbon and a little loop between it. And so you would change the variable oscillator just by moving the position of the loop on the metal ribbon. And again, it sort of created that sweeping glissando of the theremin. It was a continuous sound. And that was the first version of the Ons Martineau. But then very quickly he developed a much more sophisticated version that you see here with this keyboard. And which you can't see yet, I'll play a demonstrative video in a minute. In front of the keyboard there is that metal ribbon, which you can still control with your finger to create more of that sweeping sound. But it also had a movable keyboard, so the keyboard actually shifts like back and forth, so you can create vibrato like you could create with the theremin. There's something called the expression key, which is more like the volume control, again, to create those like kind of swelling sensations with sound that you could with the theremin and the volume knob. There were also different timbre settings, so with the theremin you just get one sound. It's that kind of high-pitched, kind of tinny sound. And with the Ons Martineau, there were multiple timbre settings. So some of them were a little bit noisier, some of them were a little louder, and you could create a little bit more variety there. And the other thing that Martineau created were these custom speakers, which he called the diffusion system. And you can see here this one that looks almost like a palm frond, which is the most interesting. It actually has metal strings connected to the front that would vibrate sympathetically with the sound and created these really interesting effects. So something that I didn't talk about with theremin, but was hopefully really apparent, is that even though these instruments were created with really unique new sort of electronic timbres, they were really created with classical music in mind. They basically thought that these would be the new orchestral instruments, or the orchestral instruments of the 20th century, which didn't really happen. So it's really interesting that even though they were so forward-thinking and really creative in thinking about new ways of using technology and electricity to generate sound, they were really thinking of a very old, very conservative musical paradigm, which we'll talk about a lot more in Lecture 3. And so, but some, I say that, however, some more classical music orchestral composers did compose special pieces for these instruments, including someone named Olivier Messiaen, who created a symphony using the Ons Martineau. There's also a composer named Edgard Varese, who we'll talk about next lecture, who composed a piece called Equatorial, which used the theremin. So these were actually used a bit in the orchestra by more forward-thinking classical composers. So here's a demonstration video of the Ons Martineau, and I'm actually not going to play it now. I'm going to include it in the page so that you can watch it on your own time after the lecture. But this should hopefully give you a much better sense of how it worked and what the different parts are. Lastly, I want to talk very briefly about one last electronic music instrument called the tritonium. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because it used yet another synthesis paradigm. So when we talked about the telharmonium, it used this additive synthesis paradigm, which is where you basically combine multiple sine tones at various amplitudes to create unique tones. Subtractive synthesis is sort of the opposite, where you start with noise, pure noise, so basically a bunch of different frequencies, and you apply a filter to it. So instead of adding frequencies, you're taking frequencies away. And so it creates, I think, in general, some more interesting sounds, but it can be a little bit more unwieldy. And so that's the only reason why I really want to talk about the tritonium, but I will play a quick video of Oscar Sala, who is basically like the Clara Rockmore of the tritonium, for you here, so that you can hear a little bit of the difference timbrally. Oh, unavailable. Let's see, we can watch this on YouTube. And you can see that this uses really an entirely different interface. So there's a metal strip that controls the sort of frequency range, and then these leather strips on top of it that act almost like a keyboard. And then there's basically just a big filter and oscillator bank that he was controlling. And there were noise generators and filters, and it really uses a much different interface than some of the other instruments that we talked about. But hopefully you can hear that the timbre created using the tritonium was really much different than the timbres possible on the theremin or the Ons Martineau. So I'm going to close this, and so that was created at really the same time as the Ons Martineau and the theremin. So there were lots of different things possible at that time. And that's it for Lecture 2. Make sure that you post any questions that you have in the discussion section, and make sure that you go over some of the key terms and the required listening so that you're ready for the quiz at the In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the aesthetic context of the course. So really the conceptual and the artistic movements that informed the content of this class. So last class we talked about the early technological developments that sort of set the technological foundation for what we're going to be talking about. And today we're really talking about the aesthetic context of the course. And then we're going to end by talking about two of the earliest pieces of electronic music. So to start, we're going to talk about the Futurism movement and the data movement. The Futurism movement, really I should say the Italian Futurist movement, because there have been subsequent Futurist movements, which we'll actually talk about later in the course, was really a multidisciplinary artistic and political movement that happened in Italy around the turn of the 19th century, really around the 19 teens. And it was made up of poets and painters and writers, and they were really obsessed with creating manifestos about what the art of the present and what the art of the future should look like. And they were very much about breaking with the past and saying that art should reflect modern life. And remember what we talked about in the last class about how with the Industrial Revolution, things like electricity and machinery became the defining characteristics of modern life. And so with the Italian Futurists, they believed that art should reflect modern life and that modern life was characterized and defined by things like electricity, machinery, noise, and the movement of the modern city. So again, they were really obsessed with progress and with a real sharp break with artistic traditions and a real sharp break with the past. And with art in particular, that looked like non-representational art. So if you were painting a picture of an orange, it didn't have to look like an orange anymore. It could look like something else. And actually here on this slide, we have a picture of one of Luigi Russolo, who we'll talk about in a minute, one of his paintings, and this is supposed to be sort of a person moving through the city, and you can see it really sort of, there's a violence to it, a sense of movement to this painting, and it's not representational. It doesn't necessarily look like someone just taking a stroll in a park in a more traditional way. So the really interesting things about this movement was that they were really interested in progress and breaking with the past, but there was a sort of dark side. As I mentioned with this painting, they really advocated for violence. It was also a really chauvinistic and paternalistic movement. There was sort of like a toxic masculinity that was characterized toward characteristic of a lot of the people involved. Women weren't included in the movement, and they were sort of considered as less than, and there was sort of advocations of violence against women, which obviously is not okay. But it's, I think, productive to still talk about these movements and the ways in which they influence the art that we're going to talk about in this course, while also sort of acknowledging the darker side. So we're going to talk a bit about Luigi Russolo, and he wasn't as much a part of this sort of more chauvinistic aspect of the Futurists, but he was very much interested in progress. And in particular, even though he was a painter and a visual artist, he was really interested in music and in sound. And in 1913, he wrote a manifesto called The Art of Noises, in which he talked about basically the sounds of the past have been exhausted. They're no longer relevant, and that the new music and music of the future should again reflect the violence and the noise of the modern city. So we have this quote here. He said, "In antiquity, life was nothing but silence. Noise was really not born before the 19th century with the advent of machinery. Today, noise reigns supreme over human sensibility. For several centuries, life went on silently or mutedly. The loudest noises were neither intense nor prolonged nor varied. In fact, nature is normally silent, except for storms, hurricanes, avalanches, cascades, and some exceptional telluric movements. This is why man was thoroughly amazed by the first sounds he obtained out of a hole in reeds or a stretched string." Again, that points to more acoustic instruments, basically, like a flute or a violin. And he said, thus, we are approaching noise sound. This revolution of music is paralleled by the increasing proliferation of machinery, sharing, and human labor. So he really is connecting these technological developments of machinery to how that's impacting basically human perception, human worldview, and how that should be reflected in art and in music in particular. So what Luigi Russolo did is he created, and I don't actually have a picture here, or actually I do right here. He created what he called intona rumori, and that's the Italian word for basically noisemaker. And you can see these here. It basically looks like black boxes with cones attached to them. These were basically just mechanical noisemakers, things like cranks, rattles, sirens, that people mechanically cranked or shook to basically make music. And he composed many pieces for these intona rumori, these noisemakers. And for him, this was sort of his answer of the problem and also his tools for creating modern sort of noise music. Again, I really want to emphasize that these were not electronic, they were mechanical, but Luigi Russolo's sort of acceptance and embrace and use of noise really prefigured attitudes towards noise that really characterized electronic music really throughout the 20th and 21st century. And unfortunately, we no longer have these intona rumori. They were destroyed in World War I. However, we do have a recording, and I'll play maybe 20 seconds of this. But this piece, The Awakening of the City, is one of your required listening, so make sure that you go back and listen to the piece in its entirety. So here's maybe the first 20 seconds. And you see here this video, it shows pictures of the intona rumori. They're boxes, and on the side they have cranks or levers, things that were pulled so that the performers could play them. They sound basically like everyday noisemakers. We've heard sounds like this, but I feel like they were pretty effective in creating maybe sort of a city soundscape that we might be familiar with from movies or things like that today. So next we're going to talk about an artist named Marcel Duchamp and the Dada movement. You may have heard about Marcel Duchamp in other classes. So Marcel Duchamp and the Dada movement was really contemporary of Rousseau and the Futurists. It just happened in a different place. Duchamp was French, and the Dada movement really took place in France and Switzerland and then kind of carried over to the United States. Duchamp was, and they were actually really responding to very similar issues, sort of breaking with the past and coming up with new forms of making art that resonated more with contemporary life. Duchamp was a painter, and he actually trained as a cubist, and we'll see one of his paintings here called Nude Descending a Staircase. It's pretty typical of a cubist work, and for those of you that aren't super familiar with Cubism, the idea is that in a single painting, you capture all the different angles of a single object in sort of one painting. Or it's like you can capture different angles in sort of one non-representational / representational image. Duchamp is really sort of a forerunner in the conceptual art movement. So conceptual art is really about not necessarily the products that someone produces, like a painting or a sculpture. It's more about the idea behind an object or an idea that accompanies an object. And there isn't always an object with conceptual art, but the ideas in conceptual art really tend to challenge common perceptions and the status quo. And this was also really influential to later performance art and also sound art, which we'll talk about more later in the class. And like the Futurists, Marcel Duchamp and conceptual artists and the Dada movement were, again, really interested with breaking with 19th century traditions and forms and values. So he very much advocated for non-representational art. So again, not necessarily having to create a painting of a tree that's called the tree. So again, to Duchamp, art didn't have to be representational, it didn't have to be rational, and he was very much towards the surreal, the irreverent, and the absurd. So we're going to talk about a series of pieces that he created called the Ready-Mades. And the Ready-Mades were a series in which he would basically take an everyday object, like a bicycle wheel, and put it in the art gallery. So his first Ready-Made was a piece called Bicycle Wheel in 1913, and here it is right here. And his most famous is a piece called The Fountain, in which he took a urinal and put it in the art gallery and signed it R. Mutt and called it The Fountain. So what do these pieces do? They really do a couple things at the same time. One, they reframe everyday objects and in a way that sort of elevates them to the status of something worthy of a lot of attention. And so this really shows the kind of art and the craft and the meaning and the significance in everyday objects. It also sort of reveals the arbitrary boundaries between everyday life, everyday objects, and art objects or the art gallery or the museum, and basically says, look, these objects, these paintings, these pieces, these sculptures are just in a museum or an art gallery because someone called them art, and that really elevates them to this status that's kind of arbitrary. It's just subjective. And it sort of does two things. It both sort of, it kind of levels the playing field and allows people to appreciate everyday objects and everyday experiences in a new light and with new significance, but it also sort of calls into question the things that are already in the gallery. And again, it sort of blurs this boundary between what's inside and what's outside an art gallery or an art museum. The other thing that these pieces did that will play into how we'll talk about sound later in the class is it really objectified things in a new way. So sort of a bicycle wheel becomes an art object and brings new significance in a way that out on the street we see bicycle wheels all the time. They're not that important, but it kind of removes it from its context, puts it in a new context in a way that makes it art. And we'll talk about this musically when we talk about sampling. And when we talk about an art movement, a musical movement called musique concrète, where you basically take a sound object, you record sound from the everyday out in the world, and you take that recording, put it in a new context, and it now becomes art, more of like a collage. So that's it for this first section of lecture 2. And then the next section we'll talk more about sort of the musical aesthetic context of the course. So we just talked about the Italian Futurists and Marcel Duchamp's Ready-Mades, and now we're going to talk about a similar shift that occurred in music around the turn of the 19th century. So just like with visual art, with music at the turn of the 19th century, there was a real shift away from tradition and towards new forms and new musical paradigms. So just to take us back to what we talked about in lecture 2, with the early years of electronic music, they were really centered around these instruments that were used to play classical music. And that was really pretty true through the end of World War II. And so what we see is inventors like Theremin and Martineau really saw their new instruments as sort of the new orchestral instruments. They were melodic instruments that kind of acted in many ways like acoustic instruments, and they didn't really explore new musical possibilities. So they very much fit these instruments into an old musical paradigm or old musical forms. So again, in a similar time frame as the Dadaists and the Futurists, there was a development of new musical aesthetics around the turn of the 19th century, and it was really a reaction against 19th century classical music. So what do I mean when I talk about classical music? So I'm really talking about a Western European musical tradition. Sometimes we call this the tonal musical tradition, and it's really centered around basically the piano, keyboard, and certain tuning and musical systems of keys and scales. And what these keys and scales do is they impose a hierarchy on this musical instrument and musical scale and basically make it such that some notes and some chords are more important than others. And I should preface all of this by saying that you're not going to be tested on this. It's just really the context for understanding a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the class. So it is good to pay attention. So the Western classical musical system really evolved over the course of about 600 years, maybe a little bit longer. It evolved out of church music traditions, so things like Gregorian chant, and things like that, and also folk music traditions in Europe. And basically what composers did over many hundreds of years is start to impose more and more rules on these musical practices and musical systems. And again, that really looked like imposing a hierarchy in which there were keys and there were scales, and within a scale, within a key, some notes and some chords are more important than others. And this was really codified in a composer like Johann Sebastian Bach, and that was true. So that's around the 1650s, and this went all the way through about the 1890s with a composer like Brahms, and they all really sort of upheld this musical system. But then what we see is towards the end of the 1800s is the system starts to break down, and we see another thing to mention about the Western tonal system is that it really prioritizes pitch. It really prioritizes frequency and notes. It also establishes rules about what we call consonance and dissonance. Basically, that some combination of notes sound better or more pleasing than others. And again, this is all tied up in this hierarchical system. But again, towards the end of the 1800s, this system really starts to break down, and we see composers start to explore the boundaries of this system more and more and more until they say, actually, this system isn't serving us anymore, we don't need it. So what happens in the early 1900s is that composers start to break the rules, and they break the rules of the keys. They start to include notes out and chords outside of the key, all the way to the point that a composer named Arnold Schoenberg does something called the emancipation of the dissonance. And I'll move to the next slide. So here we have the emancipation of the dissonance. And again, the dissonance is this idea that some combinations of notes are less pleasing than others. And he says, look, this hierarchy of keys is totally arbitrary. There shouldn't be any more hierarchy. All 12 notes on the piano are equal. So basically, he abolishes the use of traditional scales, and he creates new scales or new series of notes by basically just taking any note of the 12 notes on the piano, or the 12 kind of notes in the Western system, and instead assigns it a number and then creates new orders, basically new scales that don't have any connection to that tonal system. So here we have new organizing principles, and he tended to use old musical forms, so he would still say, write a sonata, but it was using this new series or this new scale instead that didn't reflect the old system. And this is a sort of simplified version of a very complicated history, but hopefully it gives you some sense of that there was this system that was really upheld, and then it got really broken down around the turn of the 19th century. And so what we see is that there are other composers that explored the breakdown of this system in different ways. So another composer that I want to talk about is Erik Satie. So Erik Satie was a French composer, and he's sort of the musical analog of Marcel Duchamp. He explored alternatives to the Western tonal harmonic system, this hierarchy, in different ways. And one of the ways in which he did it is instead he went back and used medieval modes, so again, scales that were outside of this harmonic tradition, and he also looked to popular music. Another idea that he had that was pretty revolutionary at the time was the idea of furniture music. And his idea with furniture music is that he often played music in cabarets. And he thought that his compositions could just be furniture music, basically background music, like the furniture, the backdrop to other things that are happening in a room at a given time. But if you think to the idea of a sort of Western classical composer, someone like Beethoven or Mozart, the idea that their music would be background music was just like blasphemous. They could not have imagined that. They would be really furious, for instance, if they went into a department store today and heard one of their symphonies as background noise. But Satie really embraced that idea and said, look, it doesn't have to be this elevated special thing. It could just be part of the ambiance, part of an environment, just like the furniture. And that really carried on into some of his other work. So one of the pieces that I'd like to talk about is a piece that he composed the music for called Parade, or Parade. And Parade is a Cubist ballet, and it was really a collaboration between Satie, who did the music, the Ballet Russe, or Russian Ballet, which was a ballet company in Paris, France, and Pablo Picasso, who designed all of the sets and all of the costumes. And the costumes and the set, by the Cubist painter Pablo Picasso, you can see it here. It's very angular, and it's, again, with Cubism, it's sort of like you're looking through an object through different angles, and all the different angles can be present in the same image at the same time, is a really good analog for Satie's music for this ballet. So basically what we get in the music, similar to the images, is really abrupt shifts in tone and character. And it's kind of like you're looking at a tune or listening to a tune from different or many angles, kind of all in the same time span. Another thing that Satie does that becomes really emblematic of music of this time is he uses kind of everyday sounds and noisemakers, things like a typewriter, gunshots, rattles, all as kind of part of the music. So I'll play a little bit of this, but I recommend that you watch it on your own. So that was an example of an abrupt shift where all of a sudden the music just shifts to a really different character. This is easily the best part. And what's interesting here is that there's no music, you just hear the sound of the steps of the horse pas de deux. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. So hopefully you got a sense of sort of how Satie really took more of like a cubist approach to the sound here. And another thing is the dancing is also kind of an analog to the sets and the music. They're really using kind of everyday movements like walking, very simple repetitive movements. It doesn't look like traditional ballet. So there is this sense of like sort of flattening a cultural hierarchy here. So the next composer that I want to talk about that sort of sets the stage for the music that we're going to talk about throughout the quarter is a composer named Edgard Varèse. And Varèse was a French composer who immigrated to the United States in the 1920s. And again, what we see with someone like Varèse is in the Western classical tradition, there's a real prioritization of pitch. But with newer composers like Varèse, he really said, pitch isn't what I want to focus on, and he focused on rhythm and timbre. And remember, timbre, Timbre, is the word that we use to describe tone color or sound character. And it's basically the word that we use to describe how, say, a trumpet sounds different than a drum. And it's really that sound quality that composers started to pay attention to rather than the pitch of an instrument. Varese is also important because he sort of is credited for coming up with a new definition of music. So rather than saying music is sound that upholds this Western classical hierarchical tradition, music is just organized sound. And his pieces very much do that. So his pieces are very much arranging timbres in time. And as you can imagine, if he's interested in timbre or sound character, he, rather than pitch, rather than using more traditional orchestral acoustic instruments, he's really interested in using percussion instruments. And so this is a piece that he composed in the 1920s called Ionization. And I'll just play a little bit of this, but you can listen to it on your own. Just jump right to the middle. You can also hear a siren in the background. So again, he's incorporating more everyday aspects. So hopefully what you heard there is just this kind of, again, arranging timbres in time. So there's a real focus on rhythm and rhythmic motives, rhythmic patterns, rather than on pitch. The next composer I'll talk about, and I'm actually going to go back to this main slide, is a composer named Ruth Crawford, or Ruth Crawford Seeger. And she was a group of composers that were really active in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And they called themselves the ultra-modernists. So again, this is signaling really a break with tradition and coming up with new musical and compositional paradigms and procedures. So that's really what Ruth Crawford was interested in, and she, like other ultra-modernist composers, developed what they called dissonant counterpoint. So counterpoint is sort of the emblematic musical compositional procedure or paradigm that is used in the Western classical tradition. It's really Bach's music is sort of held up as sort of the pinnacle of counterpoint. And basically what it is there's many musical lines that are really intricately connected and linked that happen at the same time. And so with dissonant counterpoint, rather than upholding the Western classical ideas of consonance and that everything should sound very pleasing from moment to moment and follow these rules very precisely, with dissonant counterpoint, the idea was to maximize the number of dissonant or sort of traditionally displeasing combinations at any given time, while still upholding some of the rules of counterpoint. So again, it's typically like lots of notes that are really difficult to sound at the same time and still uphold these rules. Another thing that Ruth Crawford Seeger did is she wanted to explore, sort of like Varese and Satie, new musical parameters and ways to organize music. And one of the pieces that's really easy to talk about this in is a piece called Her String Quartet 1931. So movements 1 and 2 use different dissonant counterpoint rules, and then movement 3, or section 3 of the work, instead of focusing on pitch to organize the music, she focuses on dynamics or volume. So what she does is by strategically changing the volume of the different instruments at the different time, this very simple melody emerges out of the 4 instruments just through controlling the volume. And so I'll play a little bit of movement 1 so that you can hear what dissonant counterpoint sounds like, and then I'll play a bit of movement 3. So that may sound a bit like a group of people playing Bach or something like that out of tune. That's not what's happening. It was very precise, and there were a lot of procedures and rules that she used to compose this. It was very intentional. And here is a bit of movement 3. So you can hear it's almost like they're passing the melody back and forth. Okay, and you can go back and listen to the rest of those on your own. And last, I want to talk about a composer named Henry Cowell. And hopefully you can see here that now I'm really focusing on the United States. And the experimental tradition that we're going to talk about a lot in this class was really developed and sort of defined by American music in the early 1900s, really the 19 teens through the 1950s and then 60s. And we'll talk about this more throughout the quarter. So Cowell, like Ruth Crawford Seeger and some of these other composers, was really interested in new kinds of ways to both organize music and new sounds. And his way of exploring this was coming up with alternative ways to use traditional instruments. And his instrument of choice for a long time was the piano. And so he did a couple things. One was he used something called tone clusters, which is when you use a stick or your hand and you just smash down on the piano and play many notes at once, and it creates this kind of discordant, noisy, clashing sound. But he used it really strategically in his pieces. And another thing that he developed is something that he called the string piano, which is where you play on the inside strings of the piano rather than on the keys. And this is, he did this in a piece which he called the Banshee. And so I'm going to play a video so that you can get a sense of the string piano. This one's a little cheesy. The performer definitely took on the character of the Banshee, but it should give you an idea of what the string piano is. So let's see, you can see here she's running her fingers along the strings inside the piano rather than playing the keys. And in doing this, Cowell still had, you heard there, the 3-note little melody. So he still used a melody, but he also was able to get a lot of new sounds out of an old instrument by just playing it in a new way. So the conclusion of this section is really that around the turn of the 19th century and really into the 19-teens and 1920s, just like with visual art, composers were looking for ways to break with musical traditions. They were looking for new sounds, new ways to organize sounds, and also they used old instruments in new ways to create new sounds. And again, going back to what we talked about with early electronic instruments, this is really the opposite of early electronic instruments, where they use these really, really novel new instruments to play old music. And so what we're going to talk about in the next section of this lecture are two composers that sort of break the mold and where these sort of two streams collide, where it's composers using new musical procedures while also using new electronic music devices to create new kinds of music. So in this last section of Lecture 3, we are going to talk about two early electronic music pieces. So these are pieces that both use new instruments and new compositional paradigms. So it's like the streams of lecture 2 and lecture 3 are now colliding. The first piece we're going to talk about is a piece by a composer named Johanna Bayer. Johanna Bayer is a really interesting figure. She's very enigmatic. We actually don't know that much of her life. It wasn't well documented, and she also died when she was very young and very poor. So this is getting at a theme that we'll talk about throughout the quarter, which is sort of disparities in gender, class, and race when it comes to electronic music, where the work of women, for instance, wasn't as upheld and preserved as the work of men. And she is kind of an example of that. But anyways, Johanna Bayer studied with the ultramodernists in the 1940s, or in the 1920s and 30s. She worked with Henry Cowell and Ruth Crawford and other ultramodernist composers, so she was very much familiar with that dissonant counterpoint model. And like a lot of the ultramodernists, she really wanted to shift away from thinking about pitch. She was really interested in rhythm, and she also wrote a lot of pieces for percussion. So a lot of her music is percussion music. So the piece that we're going to talk about today is a piece called The Music of the Spheres. And there is a little bit of a debate about whether or not we should consider this an early piece of electronic music, because by many definitions, it's just a very traditional musical score, which you can see here. But the reason why we consider it electronic music is that she put this note on the front page, which says for 3 electrical instruments or strings. So she put in the note of the score that it could be played by an electronic instrument. And the electronic instrument that we think she had in mind was likely the theremin. And when you listen to it, you'll understand why there are these sliding glissandos through the notes of a melody that the theremin would really be sort of perfect for. So it is likely that she was thinking of the theremin. So let's talk a little bit about the music. It's played, there are these 2 or 3, I should say, more melodic lines, plus a triangle that marks, a little metal triangle that marks the sections of the piece, and a lion's roar. So the lion's roar is the thing you'll hear at the very outset of the piece, and a lion's roar is basically just a large drum that has a string attached to it in the middle, and you pull the string and it creates a sound that kind of sounds like a lion's roar. So other aspects of this piece include, as I mentioned, an 8-note musical phrase. And think of that as basically an 8-word sentence. So it's 8 musical notes. And this creates a musical phrase that is played in 2 instruments. And what Johanna Bayer did with this 8-note musical phrase is she created a canon. So what that means is that one of the players starts the 8-note musical phrase, and then a little bit later, the second instrument starts that 8-note phrase. So they're both playing the same phrase, but it's staggered. So a really popular example of a canon is something like row, row, row your boat. So you can imagine that this is just a more sophisticated version of a canon, like row, row, row your boat. Other musical elements of this piece include a drone. So a drone is often thought of as being more of a static sound or tone that's usually in the lower register that is present throughout the entirety of a piece. It's very emblematic of, for instance, Indian classical music. But in this piece, the drone is made up of 2 notes that alternate back and forth, and you'll hear it. It's dun, 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 dun. And just by repeating those 2 notes over and over again throughout the entirety of the piece, she creates the effect of a drone. Another element of this piece is that throughout she plays around with the tempo. So it starts out at 1 speed, and then it speeds up, it accelerates, and then it gets to the middle point of the piece, and then it slowly decelerates. So there's sort of this middle point of the piece. As we lead up to it, the piece accelerates, and as we go towards the end, it decelerates. So it gets faster, and then it gets slower. So one thing that's a little bit sad about this piece is that it was never actually performed in Bayer's lifetime. It was part of a larger work called Status Quo, which was this sort of multimedia opera that was supposed to have lights and dance and sets and projections. but it was never performed, and we actually lost a lot of the music to it. And the piece was actually premiered in 1977 in Santa Cruz at the Cabrillo Music Festival by a group called the Electric Weasel Ensemble. And rather than using theremins, they actually used Buchla synthesizers. And so that is the recording that we will hear. And let's see, I will play a bit of this for you, but this is your required listening, so please listen to this piece in its entirety on your own. So that's the lion's roar. There's the triangle that's marking the section. This is the drone, the two-note drone. And this is the start of the 8-note pattern. So here's the start of the canon where the second instrument enters. Can you hear it starting to speed up? Okay, so I'm going to stop that there, and we're going to move on to talk about our last piece by a composer named John Cage. So John Cage was a very central figure in 20th and into 21st century music. So we're actually going to talk about him quite a bit throughout the quarter. And the reason why is he was really prolific. He wrote a lot of music, and he was also very curious about new technology. So every time a new technology became available, he tended to write a piece using it. And he really explored the new technology in kind of a fundamental way. So getting down to sort of the core of what that technology does. And then he applied his compositional procedures and made a piece with it. So we'll talk about him a lot throughout the quarter. So Cage, in his early career, was very much influenced by Cowell and the Ultramodernists and Perez and even Schoenberg, and he was really looking to sort of decenter pitch as the most important musical parameter. He explored rhythm and dance music and tended to think about new ways to organize music. Again, he was very much influenced by Perez, used Perez's definition of music as just organized sound. I was looking for new organizing principles. And I'm actually going to read you an excerpt of one of his writings. Another reason why Cage is really influential is that he wrote a lot about his work, which made it much more easy to understand, because in many ways it was kind of conceptual, like Marcel Duchamp's work, where the ideas behind the work were often just as important as the work itself. So this is a collection of Cage's writing called Silence. It includes a lot of his earliest writing, and I'm going to read you an excerpt from an essay called The Future of Music Credo, and this is on Canvas as your recommended reading, so you can read the entire essay on your own if you want to read more than I read now. So Cage says, "I believe that the use of noise, wherever we are, what we hear is mostly noise. When we ignore it, it disturbs us. When we listen to it, we find it fascinating. The sound of a truck at 50 miles per hour, static between stations, rain. We want to capture and control these sounds, to use them not as sound effects but as musical instruments. Every film studio has a library of sound effects recorded on film. With film phonography, it is now possible to control the amplitude and frequency of any one of these sounds and to give it rhythm within or beyond the reach of the imagination. Given 4 film phonographs, we can compose and perform a quartet for explosive motor, wind, heartbeat, and landslide. To make music, if the word is music, is sacred and reserved for 18th and 19th century instruments. We can substitute a more meaningful term, organized sound. We will continue and increase until we reach a music produced through the aid of electrical instruments. Most inventors of electrical musical instruments have attempted to imitate 18th and 19th century instruments, just as early automobile designers copied the carriage. The novochord and the solovox are examples of this desire to imitate the past rather than construct the future. When theremin provided an instrument with genuinely new possibilities, thereminists did their utmost to make the instrument sound like some old instrument, giving it a sickly sweet vibrato and performing upon it with difficulty masterpieces of the past. Although the instrument is capable of a wide variety of sound qualities obtained by tuning of a dial, thereminists act as censors, giving the public those sounds they think the public will like. We are shielded from new sound experiences. The special function of electrical instruments will be to provide complete control of the overtone structure of tones as opposed to noises, and to make those tones available in any frequency, amplitude, and duration, which will make available for musical purposes any and all sounds that can be heard, photoelectric, film, and mechanical mediums for the synthetic production of music. It is now possible for composers to make music directly, without the assistance of intermediary performers. Any design repeated often enough on a soundtrack is audible. 280 cycles per second of a soundtrack will produce one sound, whereas a portrait of Beethoven repeated 50 times per second on a soundtrack will have not only a different pitch but a different sound quality. So he is a bit tongue-in-cheek there, but what he's really saying is this new technology provides a whole new sound world for composers to explore, and not just a new sound world, a whole new means of controlling sounds in ways that make them much more independent and less reliant on instrumentalists and performers to perform their work. They could now perform it themselves, which radically shifted the dynamic of composers at this time. So we're going to talk about, another thing that he talked about is not only the potential for electronic sound, he again used Varèse's definition of music and also talked about kind of the embrace of noise. So the piece that's your required listening and that we're going to talk about now is a piece called Imaginary Landscape No. 1. So this was composed in 1939, 1 year after Johanna Bayer's Music of the Spheres, and like Johanna Bayer's piece, it uses electrical instruments in new ways, sort of prior to the development of new aesthetics that we see in after World War II. So again, these were sort of anomalies of their time. So Imaginary Landscape No. 1 was composed at a radio station in Seattle. Cage had access to this radio station. At the time, he was composing for dancers at the Cornish School, and through the Cornish School, he was able to get access to this radio station. And rather than just compose or play a recording of a piece over the radio during his radio show, he decided that he was going to use sort of some of the tools, the radio broadcasting tools that were available to compose a new piece. So what did he have available that he could use at this time? He had 2 variable speed turntables and a test tone record. So what did we learn in lecture number 1? That the frequency or the pitch that we hear a sound, whether a sound is high or low, is just how fast something is vibrating. So if you have a frequency test tone record, what would happen if you change the speed? Well, if you change it to be faster, it will sound higher, and if you change it to be slower, it will sound lower. So he used this variable speed turntable like an instrument to get different frequencies and different sort of pitches out of the turntable record. And it frankly sounds not unlike a theremin. He also, in addition to the two variable speed turntables, used a string piano like cowl, like the banshee, so playing the strings on the inside of the piano rather than the keys, and a cymbal to add some percussion to denote the sections. So in a lot of ways, structurally, it's very similar to Johanna Bayer's piece. And the piece, again, consists of 4 sections that are each 15 measures with interludes of the string piano. So one thing I want you to listen for is the difference between the turntables and the cymbal and the string piano and how that demarcates the different sections. So I actually don't have a recording on here, but it is in the required listening section, so you're going to be on your own to listen to that. Again, if you have any questions after this lecture, please write them in the discussion section on Canvas so that everyone can see your question and I can answer them or other students can answer them.